rid of my email because switch off my email browser because otherwise it will ping throughout the.
Oh,
there we go. So there we go. I'm done.
Just like yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's recording now, and
Great.
Should we start? Okay.
Sure.
Okay. So I guess can you tell us a little bit about how you came to poetry and how does performance enter your work?
Sure. So I guess potentially a long story about how I came to poetry itself, but maybe worth saying that I grew up in a house where really there was no poetry or nothing that we would call poetry at university in any case, though probably like most children I will have heard rhymes read to me as a little child, but I grew up in a house where there weren't really books, so it wasn't something that existed for me in a relationship with my parents or at home. So it was something that I discovered I guess probably when I was around about I don't know, maybe 16, something like that, 15, 16. And it always felt to me almost like a kind of contraband. It was so exotic and so remote from the world that I knew. I knew nobody at all who had ever even used the word poetry. So the school that I went to was a very impoverished, rundown state school where there wasn't, I was teaching a seminar here at Sussex the other day, and we were reading together Wordsworth's 1799 Prelude, and one of the students said, "Oh, I remember reading this at GCSE," and I was completely astonished. Wow, in fact, most people in the room were, but certainly I didn't enjoy any kind of exposure like that to poetry when I was younger, not really until A level, and then the way that poetry is taught at A level was not particularly inspiring. Anyhow, so I guess it was really when I went to Cambridge University and was fortunate enough by chance to end up under the supervision of J.H. Prynne, a poet that I greatly admire and love, that I began to read poetry very seriously and in a really dedicated way, and in a way that felt as though it was, quite quickly felt as though it amounted to a definition of my purpose being alive, my reason for being here, I guess. But there's much more to say about all of that, but specifically with respect to performance. So I've never considered myself a performance poet, it's worth saying to begin with. Partly that's from a kind of, I don't know, a kind of constitutional distaste or possibly even allergy about categories in general. I don't want to be one of any particular type of poet, I think. And that also goes for the kinds of categories that I've more often been lumped into, like Cambridge poet or whatever it might be, avant-garde poet. I don't think that I belong in any of those. So performance for me is itself a concept that I'm continually trying to think about and to investigate by doing it. So I don't have any particular idea of performance or what performance ought to be, which I then aim to live up to. Performance for me is essentially, and this is the most important thing about it, is that it is a learning experience. So by performing a poem, I aim to, or I try to learn something about what the poem means, and for a number of different reasons. First of all, because I'm very committed to, and this is virtually a kind of principle or method for me, I'm committed to writing poems whose meaning doesn't reveal itself to me at once, is potentially even very, very obscure to me. So I don't really know what my poems mean or what they're meant to sound like when I write them. So the opportunity to perform them in front of a room full of people, or even a couple of friends in a more intimate setting, has for me always been really valuable, because it gives me, first of all, from a selfish point of view, a chance simply to hear my own poem and to tune into it myself and to try to decide what's going on in it and what it means. But it's also, it's an affirming and pleasurable experience too, when you can read a poem to a room full of people, and it still is always a shock to me to feel that that the poem works and that they enjoy it, and that some transmission might have been affected, that some kind of communication, however provisional, however temporary, might have flared into possibility at that point. So I really enjoy the experience of reading. I think I've become more relaxed about it in recent years. I generally do now enjoy it. It used to be true for me when I first began reading poetry or performing poetry, when I was an undergraduate, that it felt to me like everything was at stake all of the time, and that either the reading that I gave had to be the best reading I'd ever given, or else I had treacherously like ruined this poem by just muting it or blunting its force or somehow muffling it, and that would set it off in the wrong direction into the world. So I used to feel really upset with myself if I felt like I'd not performed a poem well, if I felt like I hadn't done it justice. So yeah, I think much more, you might say, in a derogatory sense, maybe precious about it, but to me it didn't feel like that. It felt like it was just a big kind of existential demand that the poem should be voiced with sufficient passion, that it was really going to be able to reach people. I still do feel that. However, I'm more relaxed now if I don't think it's gone well, because there's always going to be another chance. So I do feel I do get quite worked up about readings, I guess, and they matter to me a great deal. I think chiefly for those two reasons, because they tell me what the poem is, so it's a pedagogical or an autodidactic experience for me, and because I want to effect a transmission, and those two things are deeply related. The second one, effecting a transmission, of course, also has a political dimension for me, but maybe we can go on and talk about that a bit later. But I started performing poetry when I was at the University of Cambridge. If by performing poetry we mean reading my own poems, though I would say that it was important for me too, the experience of acting in Shakespeare plays when I was younger, which is of course a performing of poetry as well.
Yeah. But I'm just thinking about like Cambridge, and when you started performing your poetry, was it at the Cambridge Poetry Festival, like of the 3 years that it happened?
Yeah, I did perform at that festival for the first time as one of a group of student readers. There was a special kind of quarantined sort of subsection of the festival where I and a number of other students were allowed to present some of our work, and then a little later, just in part of the general population of the lineup. That wasn't the only place though. That was the Cambridge Conference of Contemporary Poetry, or the CCCP as it used to be called. But there were other things. I used to run reading series in Cambridge too. So there was some which where the venue was a lecture theatre in Gonville and Caius College. There were other kinds of things. There was Sam Ladkin's Poetry Summit, as he called it, towards the end of my stay in Cambridge as a graduate student. And then just all around town, we used to do readings at Kettle's Yard, sometimes the art gallery there. But also, whilst I was a student, I read all over the place. So I would come and read in London sometimes, or I did readings around the country.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, I guess like there will be time, like I'm going off script now, but like everything you're saying is so interesting. But I guess like, I mean, do you want to talk a little bit now about what you're currently working on? Is that a performance? What are the concerns of your current creative work?
Yeah. So, okay, so in order to give a kind of reasonably full and accurate description of what I'm doing right now, I just need for a moment to backpedal and describe what I did before, because it will help to make sense of why I'm doing what I'm doing now. So a couple of years ago, I published a book called Scherzos Bengiosos, with the last books in Amsterdam. It's a wonderful press with a wonderful editor called Phil Baber. And that book, like all of my books, I didn't really know what it was when I was writing it. It was only toward the end of my work on the book that it became more or less clear to me, at least in a kind of rough outline, what this book meant and what it was meant to be for. And what it turned out to be for was, and this is quite a convoluted thought, but I'll do my best. It turned out to be, really without my consciously knowing it in advance, a kind of prophetic or proleptic elegy for my mother, who was alive, so hence being proleptic or prophetic. It was a poem which in the end turned out to speak as if directly to her, as though she had already died, and to try to come to terms with our history together, the history of our relationship, and of how we'd tried and sometimes failed to love each other and hear each other. So I wrote that book, and and was kind of surprised that here was something which clearly sounded like an elegy, but about someone who still was alive. And then, sadly, shortly after that book was published, my mother did die, and in an unexpected and, for me, very traumatic way. And the thing that I'm writing now is a long elegy of a kind for her, but it's not simply or strictly an elegy, but is organized as a series of meditations, is the word that I'm using for myself as I work on it, though who knows whether that will end up being in the title or not, I don't yet know. But a series of meditations on the history of my own life since childhood, and my relationship with her, and on her life too, and what I know about her life. And so it's a kind of sequence of poetic meditations on a number of different things, which inevitably arise when I think about my mother's life. Her poverty, she died in poverty, had lived her whole life in poverty, on the sort of social structures in which she felt trapped all her life, debt. She didn't have an education, she got to have school. Many other sort of social constraints and ways in which she felt stuck and suffocated for her whole life. The damages that she endured during her life that she had to live with, both things that she had done to her by others, and things that she did to herself, and things that she did to me as well. So that's what I'm writing right now. I've not finished it yet. I don't even know whether I'm halfway through. I don't know. But it's currently a kind of compulsive or compulsory writing activity for me, which is always the best spot to be in, however painful the material itself is for me now. To find myself able to write almost daily is a very rare experience, something that maybe happens once every 5 years. And then there are these great barren stretches between where I just can't put down a single word that feels true to me. So I've read out a couple of these bits, a couple of these meditations at public performance or in readings. In Brighton, I read a couple at the launch for a book by my student Kate Francis a couple of months ago.
I saw that. Yeah.
Right, yeah, I really was very pleased with how they were received that night. I was kind of astonished actually, because I read these two parts, meditations 1 and 2, both of which are deeply painful for me, though I know that there is something comical about them. But they were met with roars of laughter, which was actually really affirming.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So yeah, I was really delighted that some transmission really had been effected then. I actually started writing this whole sequence of meditations in Amsterdam last March, when my partner really generously allowed me to go to Amsterdam for about 5 days. We have 2 young children, so it's very difficult for either of us to take time away or to travel. But I was in such a terrible state, really, after my mother's death, that she said to me that I could go and do this, and I was invited over to go and give a reading. So I went, and I sat alone one evening in a bar, which is something I'd been doing for a while as a kind of practice of writing, just to go out alone and sit with a beer somewhere in public and write, and began writing meditation 1, which I didn't know would turn out to be a meditation or the beginning of anything, but I just felt like I wanted to write something whilst I was there and alone and far away. And so did, and described in the meditation itself where I was, named the bar, here I am. So a kind of clearing of the mental desk, and let's start again. And read an early draft of that first meditation there at the event in Amsterdam. And since then, I've just been writing it all of the time.
Yeah, well, okay. Thank you for telling me that. I'm just I'm moved to ask, this isn't the next question on my list, but I'm just wondering, I mean, I know how the political enters your work, but I feel like there's also a very interesting relationship between the political, the personal, and the social. Especially given what you've been saying about your mother's death and the work that you've been putting out now, it's just, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that intersection between the personal and the political anymore?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. So this is obviously a really big topic, and there's a great deal to say about it. I don't want to spend too long being too fastidious about terminology, but I do just want to say that with respect to the concept or the category of the political, this was something that maybe 10 years or so ago, I would have perhaps more quickly and unthinkingly sort of asserted was the context of my work. I would have said that, of course, my work is political, and I would have been very angry, and if anybody had tried to claim that poetry ought not to be political, or that poetry didn't have a good political effect in the world or purpose or anything else. I was very kind of strident in my defense of the political character and value of poetry. I still believe that poetry has a really important intervention to make in the world, but now I would describe it perhaps slightly differently as a socially meaningful intervention rather than, to be precise, a political intervention. And I increasingly feel the distance between politics, properly so-called, and social existence as I experience it and as it means something to me, and I feel this tension between those two being torn ever wider in my own experience, at least. And I guess what I mean by this is I'm moving toward a narrower and more parsimonious description or category of the political as simply what politicians do, what goes on in parliamentary democracies, in elections, etc. That whole kind of turgid spectacle is becoming more and more irrelevant in a way to the writing that I'm doing in this moment, at least. However, its consequences on the lives of individuals are still deeply important for the writing that I'm doing now, more than ever so. And I should say too that in insisting on a distinction here between the social and the political, really I'm just following the teachings of Karl Marx, who described politics, the whole game of politics, simply as a committee for representing the interests of the capitalists and the owners of capital, the bourgeoisie. So for him too, where the really important movements happened and where revolution potentially would happen wasn't really in politics, it was outside of politics. So if we were to allow ourselves a slightly roomier or more elastic category of the political, however, to think about social relations, poverty, things like that, then I would say that for me, these two things have always been absolutely knotted up. They're completely inseparable with each other. The spectacle of parliamentary politics is, I can only really now write about satirically, at the moment at least, but its consequences in the lives of people are, deeply painful, and I try to register the real pain that I feel about the poverty and the deprivation and the thwartedness that people experience in my poetry from a communist point of view, from a Marxist point of view. So what I'm interested in is the ways that people's lives are wasted, the ways that people are in various senses incarcerated in social existences from which they might feel that there's no possible way out, or which they might be stuck dreaming ways out of, where all of their lives they will be doing activities which, as Marx says, are hatefully contentless, meaningless activities for them, being made to go and spend 8 hours a day simply performing a repetitive act which seems to have no meaning for them. Beyond that, it simply allows them to survive and keep their heads above water. So I'm really interested in that fact, the way that life is emptied and wasted. I'm also, of course, interested in the real sort of material economic reality that most people will spend their lives producing wealth for others and will end up impoverishing themselves day by day, all the time, by doing it, and how it is that people, consciously or not, develop kinds of psychic containers for dealing with the reality of their effectual enslavement like that. What are the forms of irony, the forms of despondency, the forms even of optimism that people are required to cultivate in their own minds in order to get by on a life, just short of starvation? So poverty is really, really important for me in the way that I think about my writing, partly for personal reasons, since you ask about the connection with the personal, and particularly right now, since I'm talking about, my mother's life. I think I'm perhaps fairly unusual in being a professor at a university who was the first person in my entire extended family ever to go to any university. So I come from a background where education just kind of hadn't really happened certainly for my parents. And I grew up around children who were really poor and have certainly never dreamt of going to any university at all. So for me, it was a big shock to be kind of catapulted into particularly the one at Cambridge University. So I'm not sure I ever quite recovered from that shock and found my feet again. So I live slightly out of sync, I think, with the reality that I'm actually lucky enough to be in. Anyhow, poverty, labour, of course, all sorts of other meaningful questions are really important for me too, especially about war and imperialism, though I'm not writing so directly about that as I was for a very long time, for about 10 years. But you know, I could go on, but maybe I'll stop there.
Again, I mean, I'm just like thinking about like what you said, and does the autobiographical, like, is this the first time that the autobiographical has entered your work, or?
So no, it's not. I think my poetry has always been autobiographical to one extent or another. And with each new book that I write, this is a question that I revisit again deliberately to try to figure out what kind of space I might be able to make in which I will be able to reflect in a way on my own history, on my own life, the histories of those people that I love and know, in a way that might lead ultimately to some kind of transformation or of my own life or theirs potentially, or at least, you know, virtually of theirs, or might allow me to unblock some potential to change in the future, to keep going, to find a future worth keeping going for. So it's the autobiographical is not sort of the end in itself for me, but sort of exploring my own life autobiographically through poetic writing is always an attempt to try to transform the experience of being alive and the relationship to the future. So some books that I've written have been more explicit about trying to make this space. So the Odes to the TL61P that I published in 2013 was, among many other things, almost a kind of programmatic attempt to explore and to think about childhood sexuality, my own childhood sexuality. So the moments in very early childhood where I first remember feeling a desire, or first remember feeling coerced, or first remember feeling hurt in connection with desire or in connection with intimacy with another person. And early sexual experiences too, the kind of childish experiences that lots of people have, of like, you know, two children showing themselves to each other or touching each other or whatever it might be, right all the way up to adult sexuality. So I was trying in that book to explore from in an autobiographical way how the development of my own sexuality and all of its damage, and as well as the happiness in it, was during my life tangled up together with the social histories that I had inhabited and lived through too. So that's one example, but really in every one of my books there is more or less of autobiographical material, more or less explicit, more or less secreted. Sometimes it only feels like I'm able to make it true if it's kind of out of sight, more or less, if it's kind of ambiguous or perhaps even slightly cryptic. And at other times I want it to be absolutely front and center, totally explicit. So the stuff that I'm writing now about my mother, it's flips back and forth. Some of it is very, very explicit. I mean, there's one part of it which is virtually a verbatim description of conversations that I had to have on the phone with debt recovery agents who were trying to get back money that my mother had secretly accumulated in debts. And it was as you can imagine, really painful, dispiriting experience, kind of more or less transcribed from memory what I can remember them saying to me about her debts, which I didn't know about when she was alive. So but in that case, that clearly has, again, a political bearing, or bearing on, you know, an experience that lots of people who are poor are stuck with, you know, living their entire lives feeling crushed and pressurized by debt. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I don't know how to move on after that. Like, well, so we've got this. Should we? Yeah. Well, the next question, I guess, is when you think back on your journey as a poet and performer, what were significant moments for you during that journey?
Yeah, there are so many. I mean, I feel in a way blessed or fortunate to, well, first of all, to write, to have poetry in me worth, or, you know, sometimes feels worth pulling out and putting into the world. Secondly, to have been able to share it with so many, you know, lovely, intelligent people who've got such good things to say about it. So I really do feel, you know, I feel deeply grateful that I've been able to live in communities and among people who've been able to respond to me. So there've been many, many significant moments for me, I think. So if I ever were to write a straightforward poet's autobiography, there'd be a lot of names in it and people I want to thank. So I don't know, significant moments. It was certainly a significant moment when I first kind of encountered poetry and thought that I could write it, first of all. And I remember probably like many people, one of my first encounters that meant something to me was with the poetry of T.S. Eliot. Simply, you know, it's the kind of thing that you could actually find in a local bookshop. Also, my first encounter with Wordsworth's The Prelude, which is probably the very first thing that I looked at. Couldn't read at all, had no idea what to make of it, literally couldn't even paraphrase the sense of it, but felt immediately captivated and as though I'd sort of been floated into a different kind of space of meaning. When I went to Cambridge, that was really important, and I was, as I mentioned, really fortunate in ending up in a college where J.H. Prynne was my director of studies. And when I first took my poems to show him, kind of really nervously, here, you know, these printed things which I'd written when I was a sixth former, he was really exemplary in the delicacy with which he kind of let me down and gave me to understand that these weren't very good poems, and that he described them as a bit occasional, I remember. And this word was very nicely chosen, a bit occasional. I think it just meant that they were the typical kind of mainstream boring poems about some event that happened in my day, in which I'm now, you know, reflecting on, meditating on. You know, I went out and look at the bird in the sky. Now I'm going to write this poem. So he was a great despiser of mainstream poetry. So, you know, very healthily sort of let the wind out of me, and told me to go away and read a lot of things, and handed me a load of pamphlets by unreadable mad poets, and I did that.
Yeah, that sounds
really right. Yeah, and I read his poetry, and that made a big difference to me too. Really important moment for me was when in 2007 I wrote a poem called Hot White Andy, which was published in the Chicago Review, a special issue of the Chicago Review, which presented 4 English poets in a special section on English poetry. And then we did a little tour of the States, where we went to lots of different places in sort of in the northeast of the States, and out as far west as South Bend and Chicago. And it was just a wonderful trip. It just felt like such a romance. I felt completely swept off my feet for the first time, and really in a different world as a poet, you know, on the tour bus going from campus to campus, doing these readings with some really dear beloved friends. Just had a great time and felt like something had really changed for me then. You know, the work existed in a new, bigger world somehow. And then the video that a friend of mine made of, you know, I didn't know him at the time really, a friend called Justin Katko, made of my reading in Miami, Ohio, which he stuck online. And then at the time I was completely, you know, inexperienced about the internet, didn't really know about YouTube or anything, and suddenly that reading got tons of views, and then people began talking about my poetry. So I guess that was when my poetry reached a much bigger audience at that point. I guess moving to work at Sussex in 2004, getting out of Cambridge and into Brighton, into a different world where, so far as I could see at least, there didn't yet exist a complete community around me that I could simply slot into. There certainly were poets doing lots of great things, but I set about trying to build a community with my students. And you know, I, and certainly not only I, lots and lots of other people too, have, you know, collectively built over the years, I think, a really wonderful community here in Brighton. So that's been really important for me. And I think, since I've already mentioned it anyhow, my mother's death is probably a really important moment for me as a poet, because I've been always writing with her or to her in a way. So her actual non-existence in the world has changed what I'm doing, I think, a lot for me. Also meeting Andrea Brady when I was an undergraduate in my first year in 1995 absolutely opened up the world of poetry to me. She was this wonderful, dazzling intellect who you know, had flown over to Cambridge from the to me completely exotic world of Manhattan, and knew so much more than I did about poetry, and taught me a lot about it. And then we started this Spark Press together. So yeah, that was a huge moment for me as well.
Yeah,
there are many more, but yeah.
I love to talk about like your transatlantic journey, and then your role as an organizer, and then as a publisher as well. Like, you know, it's very, it's really wide ranging. Okay, I guess, like, should we like move on to, I mean, we have been talking about your artistic practices, but I guess like these questions are a bit more. So what art forms have you worked in or want to experiment with in your poetry career?
So do you mean by this art forms besides writing? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or maybe
Right.
like besides, I mean, have you experimented with media or
Right.
like, different media, like, or something like that, I guess. Like,
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks. So I mean, I did lots of things when I was a young boy, like I'm sure lots of people do. I used to love to, I mean, long before I ever wrote a poem, I loved art, like painting and drawing, that's and playing music. But since then, more recently, for years, and still I hope in the future too, I used to and may yet again experiment with collaborations with musicians. Principally with a musician called Stuart Calton, who is also a fantastic poet and a dear friend, someone I love and whose work I love. And he makes music under the name THF Drenching, which I urge everyone to check out his website. Yeah, THF Drenching. He's just a completely singular and unprecedented artist in sound. I don't think there is anyone else really like him. And he's a virtuosic musician with a dictaphone. He plays a dictaphone with tapes in by scrambling them and fast forwarding them back and forth, and makes his own composed as well as improvised music. And he has put out dozens and dozens of records, all made himself in his own bedroom. And he's just a wild, extreme and unrepeatable musician. So yeah, I worked with him a lot and done some live gigs with him, and with other musicians too. I played sometimes. Read my poetry with bands here in Brighton, including Binsklag, a band which is Verity Spott and Carl War, other musicians, plenty of time. So I quite enjoy doing that, though it doesn't always come off. I think it's a kind of hit and miss that, and in a way it doesn't really matter because it's all just about being kind of raucous and unhinged as much as anybody. But also I've worked a number of times with the visual artist Stephen G. Rhodes, who is again a dear friend, an American artist who's just makes these incredible installation pieces as well as paintings in more recent years, and he's had these great shows in Berlin and elsewhere that I've before I had children was a bit freer. I used to go over to his openings and we'd hang out, and I'd written some pieces about him and what his art means to me. And we've collaborated on a number of things, including a couple of years ago, an installation in a vape shop of all places here in Brighton.
In Brighton? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a tiny room at the back, almost just like a cupboard at the back of a vape shop, where we made a piece called Moral Support, where it's really almost all Stephen's work. In fact, we walked into the room and it's like walking onto the set of E.T. Suddenly you're just in this kind of child's bedroom with stuffed toys falling out of the walls and a sinister toilet installation, which looks like something out of a detainment facility. And I just wrote a poem, which was pasted up into the wall to go with it, so that it was a kind of a dialogue between text and space, or between text and installation. But my own, I used to sometimes experiment making my own music when I was in my 20s. And may sometimes stick that up on the internet. I don't know. At the same time, I used to play sometimes in a band called Pence 11.
Does that still exist? Or
it doesn't still exist. I wasn't properly a member of it, but Stu Calton, who I mentioned, was the guitarist in this band, and the bassist was called Nathan Blunt. He's another dear friend of mine. And then Stu dropped out of the band, so Nathan brought me in, and I used to do gigs with Nathan as Pence 11. But Pence 11 is a really great band. I didn't write any of the songs. I was just kind of brought in as a kind of session guitarist, I guess. But yeah, if you look online, there's some fantastic
didn't know about this at all. Like, this is like brand new information. Like you as a guitarist. It's just But I mean, okay, I'm just thinking, because like, I guess like this is what I'm thinking about right now, but like, why is this kind of intersection work between music and visual practice and poetry? Why is that important for you? Or what do you think about the ethos behind it? Like,
I guess it's important to me, first of all, just because I want to have a fun life. So I just really enjoy doing stuff with people. Particularly now that I've got 2 young children, it's very hard ever to go out. So if I have a particular kind of pretext for going out, that I have to collaborate with someone to do something, then that really helps to plan ahead. But also, I just enjoy it. It's just really lovely to get together with some friends and make music and to read poetry. But beyond that, I guess it's interesting. Again, for me, being a a kind of pedagogue and being a poet go absolutely hand in hand. So I'm always trying to learn something, always trying to teach something. It's a bit unremitting, honestly. It's a bit exhausting, but I think that by working with musicians, working with artists, I'm going to learn something about the capacities of language, about what I can do as a poet. I'm not sure that, I mean, I think the stuff that I've managed to do with other people, there's more space yet. There's more to be done yet. And that's partly because we just never seem to have that much time actually to get into it. I'd love to go away on a kind of retreat or something with Stephen or with a musician and spend a month really exploring what could be done. But the truth is that, certainly in the world that I live in, these kinds of productions happen in tiny windows of possibility, so that they inevitably end up being kind of improvisatory. And but then so you just have to turn that into a virtue and explore what can be done spontaneously.
Yeah, I was really thinking about how it sort of also contributes to the broadening of poetry as a genre. Something that really comes across in your work as well. So and so it's really interesting that you're trying out other forms of media and art as well, for that. Okay. So I mean, this is also something that you were talking about in the beginning of the interview, but there are various terms for a poet's performance practice. So what would you call your performance work, and has that definition changed over time?
Okay, so I wouldn't really call it anything. I would have to think a bit before even assenting to the description performance work. I'm not sure that I think of performance as part of the work that I do exactly. I guess without ever really fully thinking about it, I guess I've generally imagined performance as a kind of day off rather than as work. So, you've done all your work and now you get to go and enjoy it for a bit. So, but then there's a significance to that too, kind of enjoying the fruit of your own labor, I suppose, and being able to share it, share it around. So I think of it more like that rather than as part of the work. But I guess it definitely does have a kind of, it has a use for the work itself, because quite often I'll sit before doing a reading in like in the Hope and Ruin in Brighton, say, and in the 10 minutes before my reading, I'll be anxiously looking over the thing I'm about to read, and I will very, very quickly revise parts of it and then change it for that reading. So sometimes it helps me to revise on the spot, but also it helps me to revise subsequently when I read something out and then I realize that some bit might not have worked so well, or that it could be a bit shorter, or so I'll cut sometimes afterwards. So it is a kind of work, I guess. But I'm really not comfortable with categories. I'm certainly not a spoken word poet. I'm certainly not a slam poet. I wouldn't call myself a performance poet. Some people have sometimes said to me that my poetry has only really made any kind of sense for them at all when they've heard it in performance, or that they've liked it better once they've heard it in performance. And I've always been slightly irritated to hear that, not to be told it, because of course they're entitled to tell me and it's useful to hear, but just a bit annoyed with myself that could be true, because I want the thing to be equally effective in transmission, regardless whether I'm there or not. But I guess the truth is that for a lot of people that it just isn't. So I like to share it however I can, I guess. But yeah, I don't have a category for what I do.
Yeah, they're dreadful. But okay. Well, the third question is actually, so what does the term spoken word poetry mean to you? And has that changed over time?
So I can be a little sort of prickly about this, I think. It's certainly changed over time, again, since I had children, because I virtually never get to go out. So the chances of me going to a spoken word poetry night are nil now. But even before I had children, they were close to nil, because I don't think of spoken word poetry as a kind of poetry that I'm at all interested in, to be honest. For me, spoken word is an alternative to poetry. There's even a joke about this in one of the meditations that I'm writing now, an extremely dark joke, in which I imagine, I don't know how much to say about this, but it's in which I imagine my mother dying on stage as a spoken word poet, and it's the whole, when I sent my recording of that poem, incidentally, in which my mother kills herself as a spoken word act on stage, I sent that to my friend Verity Spott, who is another poet that I really love, whose work I really love. And before Verity got into the kind of more crazy stuff that that she does now and that I do and that our friends do. Verity used to sort of know those spoken word poetry scenes a lot better and used to hang out there and maybe even do that kind of thing a bit. Yeah. And when I sent Verity this recording that I'd made, you know, just a very private one for a couple of friends of this poem about my mother being the spoken word thing, Verity sent back this really, really long voice response to it recording, just talking about how this has really touched lots of nerves, because not really anything to do with my mother, but to do with how at so many spoken word nights, so-called, poets are expected effectively to kind of excoriate themselves emotionally in front of an audience. They're to become this spectacle of the damaged self. It's very much about kind of, you know, sort of presenting to the world a damaged identity that requires affirmation. And so Verity described how poets that she knew had been advised at spoken word nights to go on stage and, you know, talk about their most painful memories, their most painful experiences, the ways in which they were most fucked up or damaged or whatever, because that's the kind of thing that people naturally are going to applaud and even hold up their best scorecards for at spoken word nights, etc. So there's a kind of culture that I've seen, though I don't know too much about it, at spoken word nights, where it really is about a kind of conscription into asymmetrical group therapy, which is just very unappealing to me. And none of the poetry that I like or read could be called spoken word.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And then you also feel a bit uneasy about the term like performance poet as well, right?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think it's a kind of, it's something that's only really existed in the later 20th century, I think. And my interest in poetry goes back, you know, 1,000 years, honestly. I'm much more interested in 14th century poetry than I am in contemporary performance poetry, even from the point of view of performance, in fact. So, you know, the so-called performance poetry, which would sort of present itself under that heading that I've seen, and I used to see a bit of it now and then, tends actually to be so lifeless on the page, so lifeless as written language, that really it's written only for a certain kind of bravura theatrics in public. It's only for a kind of intellectually upmarket MC, you know. It's just like someone who goes and likes, you know, it gives you a sort of taste of, or an idea that you're getting a taste of something which is sort of literary, but really it's just about kind of going along and hearing some stand-up comedy that isn't as good as real stand-up comedy. Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I guess like now this part of the interview is about like traditions and canons.
Yeah.
Have been talking about your influences a little bit, but which poet, stretching from the revival years to the more contemporary, but we can even go further back. So which poets inspire you as performers and why?
As performers, yeah. Yeah, I'm going to end up quibbling with every word, but I've never really understood the whole periodization implied by the word revival. I just don't think that, I don't know, that doesn't seem true to me. Anyhow, performers. So it's tricky, this. There are some poets who I deeply love who have never really impressed me that much with their performances, but I therefore find their performances very interesting because I'm thinking, what an amazing poem, and how come you're sort of giving it to me in such a stilted way? So even that kind of performance is in a sense interesting. But the ones who are really virtuosic or impressive, or, you know, I was just blown away by the actual performance itself. I mean, I guess legendarily, Tom Raworth was a really amazing performer of his poetry. Partly, you know, for the obvious reason that he was incredibly fast, but it wasn't just speed, it was a certain kind of articulate velocity. So he would be able to just scream through a poetical text, observing all of these minute little tremors and intonation at an incredible pace so that you barely could keep up with the syntax. And I really found that very exhilarating, like everyone else, I think. So I'm sure you'll get that answer a lot.
It's absolutely, yeah.
And, you know, that influenced me. I think it's probably true to say. I think also it's true that I instinctively have always read my poetry really fast until quite recently. And the question of speed is really important for me in the voicing of poetry. I'm going to say voicing rather than performance for a bit.
Yeah, okay.
So in the poetry's implicit potential vocalization, which is there when you're writing it on the page, for me has a kind of tempo. So I think musically when I'm writing all of the time, I think like a musician, like how fast would this be played? What would be lost if it were played too fast? What would be lost if it were played too slow? Does it have a kind of tempo? Does it need to be organized according to certain kinds of more or less explicit tempi indications? So that's how I think as a musician when I'm writing. And so there are some poets who will hurry through their poems and it just to no effect, but there's a kind of musical velocity that I'm really interested in. Another poet who used to do that back in the day, but who I haven't heard for a really long time, was Miles Champion. I don't know if you know him, an English poet who now lives in New York, but even, you know, there was a moment where there was a kind of claim to fame for Miles. I don't know how he felt about it, but that he was even faster than Tom Raworth. So yeah, he used to read at this absolutely blistering, you know, hurtling rate, which was again totally dazzling. First of all, simply as kind of you know, kind of oral dexterity, if that's a silly way of putting it, but yeah, he could just simply make words happen very, very, very quickly, and was again dazzling in his articulation. Another poet who I remember hearing read and who made a very strong impression on me, and who I since have listened to a lot online, is the French poet Christian Prigent, who's I guess must be quite old now, and he's a poet who doesn't only read words aloud, but also kind of hyperventilates and turns his entire body into this kind of, I don't know, this pneumatic device for the delivery of a kind of mutilated meaning, which is incredible. So if you listen online to his poetry, such as Liste de langues que je parle, you know, list of languages which I speak, and it's just him like having a kind of attack of the hiccups. It's amazing, really. Kind of just something with his diaphragm and with his mouth that's amazing. So I like that. I like that more than I like the so-called kind of sound poetry stuff.
So like and yeah, okay.
Yeah, those guys. I mean,
those guys.
I was interested in that. I think I was interested in that, but that was never. There was always something, and I'll probably get into trouble for this, but I always felt there was something slightly ridiculous about the kind of just sort of making lots of noises with your mouth and you know, reading a phone book page by gargling or something. That wasn't ever really something that grabbed me. It didn't feel, I don't know, it didn't feel somehow bodily enough, actually, even though in a way it was kind of presenting a more embodied version of a text. What I liked about Prigent is it felt like his body was spasming. It was almost like he was actually having a kind of, you know, kind of intellectual heart attack as he was reading his poems. Whereas those guys, it always felt much more kind of leisurely, like they held the object and made lots of noises and turned it upside down. And it was like someone, you know, just playing around on a synthesizer and seeing what noises came out. So I was never that interested in that. Yeah, I mean, rappers, you know, for years I was just completely obsessional about rap and hip hop, and still listen to it all the time. So yeah, I mean, again, the dexterity, the skills, the articulate velocity of rap, how aggressive it is. I love aggression. I love the aggression in rap. Totally unapologetic, confrontational, fighting talk of rap was really inspirational to me, especially for a lot of my political poems. So I loved that. Yeah, and I don't know, listening to anything far out from a long time ago, you know, listening to Kurt Ursonata, though it wasn't a direct influence on me, but I still love hearing that kind of thing. Or no, there was a period when I loved hearing Frank O'Hara's readings online, like I think everyone now does, now that they're all really popular on YouTube. Tom Leonard's poems, his recordings, really good for me. Yeah. I remember really distinctly hearing Lisa Robertson read in London, and I used to get drunk whenever I went to a poetry reading to kind of bear the anxiety of it all. But I remember one night that I made a decision that this time I was going to be really serious and sober, and it was a Lisa Robertson reading, and I was really impressed. Just listening carefully to how much concentration and thought there was shaping the delivery of every phrase. Yeah, I've often liked her. There was a great reading I saw, one of the most memorable ones at the Cambridge Conference of Contemporary Poetry for me. It was a reading by the poet Rod Smith, who lives in Washington, where he was reading a kind of political poem about sort of revolutionary optimism, and he just turned around and head-butted the wall at the back of the room. And I thought that was hilarious. I really loved that. So yeah, I mean, Peter Manson is an incredible reader of his verse, just so richly musically eloquent in the delivery of his poetry, which is completely sculpted and crafted at that level too. And here it's worth sort of revisiting this distinction between performance poetry and what I think is poetry. That whereas Peter, I mean, his performance is definitely practiced, it's definitely artful, it's beautifully musically shaped, and it's delivered with wonderful skill. But you can hear as you do it, certainly if you've read a lot of poetry, you can hear that it's there in the poetry. And so he's realizing, he's enlivening the language itself by voicing it, rather than just getting any old thing and sort of being good at throwing his voice around. So, you know, Peter's someone who's, you know, intensively studied, you know, the poetry of Mallarmé, Ezra Pound, these wonderful modernist musics, as well as music itself, and you can really hear it when he reads. I'm forgetting a million people. Verity Spott is a great reader of her poetry. You know, Joan Luder's readings at the recent Poetry Festival events at High Zero have been amazing. Look, there's loads and loads of people.
Yeah, I mean, I was also thinking of like Sean Bonney or like someone like Alice Notley. I mean, you know, like aggression and you know, breath work in Sweden. And immediately sort of like thinking of Sean Bonney a little bit, like
sure, I mean, you know,
loads of people. That's a huge arc that we just like covered, but thank you. Well, and I guess, like, I mean, you've answered this already, but do you situate your work in relation to a specific poetry tradition, or do you consciously try to avoid, like, you know, demarcation?
Again, a potentially long answer to this question, but I'll try to keep it brief. Not to a tradition, but to many traditions, and within each individual poem. And I only really now write book length poems. I don't write short poems. So within each kind of, you know, 50 to 100 page poem that I write, I'm trying to explore and to create dialogues, lines of communication, channels into lots and lots of different kinds of traditions, and to constellate them and to kind of bring them into a new kind of dialogue or relation. So for example, in the current work that I'm writing right now, I am reaching quite far back and right into a lot of 13th, 14th, 15th century French, German, and English poetry of the sort of Middle Ages, medieval poetry, trying to learn as much as I possibly can from that work, both at a technical and sort of emotional, historical level. I'm also right now trying to kind of re-examine in what feels like a kind of insane satirical way the whole question about so-called romantic subjectivity through exploring various kinds of tradition of political commentary around about the time of the French Revolution. So not poetical traditions in this case, but intellectual and political traditions of political economy and of political writing. I'm always trying to explore different histories and traditions of metrical technique all of the time. So I've just completed 2 sestinas in prose, which are done, you know, the proper sort of troubadour complex structures. I've folded into my poems secret translations of lots of European poets, as through an effort to try to study, imitate, learn from, particularly their metrical practices. So, you know, there are translations of Goethe or Schiller or lots of people tucked in. I'm always trying to translate poets from other languages too, to learn about them. So not many different traditions. I feel much more intimately connected with, I mean, this may of course be a delusion or a fantasy of mine, but I feel more intimately connected with the poetry of the period, let's say, 1790 to 1840 than I do with a lot of what's going on now today. I feel more intimately connected with the poetry of the Jacobean period, poetry of John Donne and his contemporaries, than I do with performance poetry and slam poetry today. I have no relation to that stuff at all. So for me, and again, I could defend this in a kind of Marxist theoretical way, but I believe in trying to keep alive and to realize again now in the present the potentials of historical verse practices, which are by now more or less kind of obfuscated or occluded or are swallowed up in institutional kinds of contexts where they're valued because they're stuff that scholars do things with. But I want that poetry still to sing, still to be alive. All of that old stuff, it sings to me. So yeah, lots and lots of different traditions. I think that I'm trying to stay in touch with. However, I know that that's a slightly kind of roundabout and maybe evasive answer. If someone else was to put me in a tradition, I guess they'd either dump me in the kind of Cambridge tradition or a Brighton. Maybe there is actually now a Brighton tradition, which I'm really happy about. That's great if there is one. I feel slightly more uneasy about the Cambridge one, though I love lots of the people there, but I just feel like I made a very conscious effort to move away from it and to redefine what I was doing. So I feel like I have connections with it, but I'm not really part of it exactly now. But as far as Brighton goes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we can talk about like the Brighton poetry scene though. Like that was so interesting. Even, I mean, I guess like stretching from maybe like when Andrea Crozier was in Sussex, and then and now like the thriving like the Brighton poetry scene. Like that's also like, that's also really interesting to like think about.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a scene. I mean, scenes are all sort of scenic in different ways. In the Cambridge scene involved, everyone was at a loose end. Everyone was free. When you're a student, you're much freer. You can do what you like. So we used to all get together all the time, 3 nights a week, staying up until the small hours, arguing and talking about poetry. So in that sense, it was much more, it was much more effervescent. It was much more of a kind of fertile kind of coming together of people. Whereas in Brighton, it's just there's a lot of people a bit older and it's harder. Everyone jobs now. You can't just hang out all night all of the time. Some people do, but most people can't. So the ways in which we come together, I think everyone's very, very grateful to be able to meet up. And there's a real spirit of generosity, and even I think it's true compassion as well in Brighton, where people are very, for as long as I've been here, very thoughtful, very generous in the ways that they talk to each other about their work, which has been fantastic. Andrew Crozier, I never knew really, but he was here when I arrived. He was still alive then, but he died very shortly after I arrived. So he was never really a person in my life, though of course I know his work. Always was really interested in everything that he'd done with the English Intelligencer and everything else. Similarly with Lee Harwood, who was here in Brighton, I met him a couple of times, went to a lovely event at his flat in Hove, where there was a reading, and he seemed like a lovely person, but I didn't really get to know him. Tom Raworth, of course, lived here in Brighton for quite a while too, and I didn't really hang out with Tom that much, though whenever we were at readings, we'd hang out and chat to each other, and that was always really good fun. And we went to China together and did other things together. But I mean, the people that in Brighton over the years, there've been so many generations of students who come through. Right from the first generation that I taught us in 2004, and in that year there's a whole bunch of people who have gone on to become really interesting poets, and in most of the years since there have been. So if I were to come up with a list now of all of the students that I was lucky enough to share some time with here at Sussex and who are now out there in the world publishing books, it would be a really long list. There's a huge number of people, which is really exciting. And lots of them all know each other, of course. And, but then there are some stalwarts who are still here and always always going to be here, who organize things really often. So it's a really nice scene, I think.
It's a bit of it was really nice. It was really like welcoming as well.
And
then there was the Sussex Poetry Festival, and the events at High Zero, and then all of that, but I mean we can talk about that later. But I guess you've already talked about the inheritances and the histories in your work. Do you want to say a little bit more on that, or should we skip?
Well, I would just say that for me, again, inheritances is a word I'm really not comfortable with at all. So it's part of the class structure. So I just
the anxiety. Yeah.
So we were talking about this on a discussion list the other day, and I mentioned an essay by Stephanie Burt where.
Oh goodness! Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Do you want to?
No. I know the essay you're talking about, and and I've been talking to a few people about, and there was a review as well, but we will talk.
Okay. Sorry. Which one? Which one are you talking about?
So I think I guess the one review by Stephanie Burt, which was created a bit of a controversy, kind of a situation with a few people.
And review of what? What was it a review of?
Of another poet. I think of another poet.
Oh, okay. No, I don't think I've seen that actually. I'm slightly a bit oblivious to a lot of what goes on because I'm not on any social media and I just don't hear about anything. But the thing I meant was an article about the sestina.
Oh, okay.
And it's this I don't have any comment to make about the article by Stephanie, but just that Stephanie had said that today to write a sestina you don't need to know anything about inherited forms, and so I just started having a bit of a sort of an uppity conniption about this word inherited in a discussion list where I've never understood the use of old forms as an inheritance. And I think that there's so much that's toxic about this concept of inheritance, so much that's problematic about it for me, that I haven't inherited anything. I don't plan to inherit anything. So I don't have any inheritances in my work. But there are traditions, certainly, and specific histories, absolutely, histories of intervention into the world, histories of, documentarian type writing, histories of satire, histories of translation, histories of metrical writing, everything. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much. I think of myself as very much a historical poet in that sense. I mean, everyone is, whether they want to be or not. But yeah, I'm really trying to tell the story of the history that I'm living through by reaching back as far as I can. So when I'm now writing about the history of the French Revolution, for example, and the history specifically about forms of terrorist violence and about what people felt about agricultural enclosures around that time, I mean, this is kind of this is a shibboleth of the left that, talking about the commons, but people have not really talked much about enclosures themselves, though people have talked about the theory of closure. My friend Lynn Huginian, most influentially, has written a lot about that. But yeah, I've been going back and reading actual, arguments in favor of enclosure by landowners from the time, and trying to think about these as potentially a way for me to help to understand the lives of poor people right now. So really long histories. I'm trying all the time to reach back into the past, to construct these really long kind of historical narratives, which are slightly surrealistic and haphazard and satirical all of the time as well.
Interestingly, so I mean, I was interviewing Denise Riley very recently, and she said the exact same thing about sort of using the past in her work. She sort of defended it in a very Foucauldian kind of a way, but it was very interesting to sort of hear that, as well from her. Yeah. Okay. So what would you consider as key events? And I guess this question exists because I guess the project sort of is very focused on events in British poetry performance. So I guess what would you consider as key events in the history of British poetry performance, 1960s onwards?
Yeah. It's really tricky. Okay, I will resist the temptation to start theorizing this concept of the event.
No, do it. Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't know. In terms of cultural milestones, I'm not sure really. I'd need to think about it. I guess I ought to have thought about it in preparation, but I haven't done enough thinking about it. For me, I'd like to think about the event as a whole festival, say, or an event that included lots of readings, lots of people. That's usually felt more important to me than one person giving a reading. Of course, I do love hearing a good reading by one person, and that might be more influential on my own work in a direct and obvious way. But the events, I mean, to begin by talking about my own experience, what's been important for me as an event, the Cambridge events were certainly really important. The Cambridge Poetry Festivals were really important. They were always so fractious. There was always so much bickering and so much passionate argument too, sometimes real fallings out and chaos emotionally. But at the time, it just didn't feel like I think it would feel right now. It really didn't. And maybe, I don't think that's just me. I don't think it's just I who felt like that. I think nobody seemed to feel like it was, you know, I can remember one of these festivals where Anna Mendelssohn slapped someone around the face really hard at a dinner table. I can remember other things where, you know, there was virtually a fist fight between Stephen Rodifer and someone else in a bar. They were extremely fractious events. But somehow it just felt like this is what poetry full of life is inevitably going to do to people. The whole thing was just this really vibrant provocation. And there was just not bad blood in the same way that there has been, I think, since the rise of the internet and social media, where people are constantly leaving these footprints of antagonism and antipathy to each other. You know, it was somehow possible for people to just kind of ventilate these moments of anger with each other and not worry about it being at all definitive of anything at all. You know, people were just arguing with each other. And so there was a kind of rambunctiousness, a kind of liveliness to the events there, which I really miss, actually. I do miss it. I mean, it's certainly true also that some people behaved pretty badly sometimes in those contexts, and regrettably, genuinely regrettably, but nonetheless, there was a lot of life there. I'm not sure I would want it back, because I think the world is different now. The world has moved on, history has changed. But that was important for me, the ability to just argue all night with people. Yeah. And I think for lots of other people too. I think that really was an event, not just for me, but for others. But yeah, then the poetry festivals down here in Brighton, I think, have been really eventful, have been really important too, for lots of people. A different kind of atmosphere, a different kind of weather, a different kind of air. So yeah, they've been really eventful. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the readings that have happened, some spontaneously, some planned during protests around about the time of protests 2010, the student protests then, and then in the subsequent campus occupations all over the country. But you know, locally here at Sussex, we had events, readings in occupied spaces, which felt good, which felt uplifting, but also which were just difficult because, you know, it just made me sad in a way to know that, you know, that there was so much life possible, so much kind of, you know, sort of spontaneous communization that was possible, but it happened so rarely and only under the duress of people being, you know, tossed out of their jobs and impoverished. So I would always feel both exhilarated and saddened by those kinds of contexts, because I wanted this to go on. I wanted it to always be possible, to always exist. I mean, Verity, my friend Verity Spott, posted to this discussion list the other day, an event at the Cowley Club in Brighton about 12 years ago, where I did a reading, Verity played music, lots of other people did things, and which is where I met a lot of my friends in the Brighton scene now for the very first time. So again, personally, autobiographically, that was a really important one for me. A lot of the High Zero Christmas parties that Joe Luna organised were really, really good events, because we'd stay up all night celebrating afterwards. It just felt so life-affirming, so kind of vivid, the whole thing. But historically, the important readings, yeah, I don't know, really. I just don't know. I guess the truth is I've never really thought about them as being historically monumental in that way. I've always thought about them as being kind of social and transient and just part of what it's like to live life. Like my answer about art or collaborating is how to have fun. So I don't really think I've ever gone along to readings thinking, is this going to be a really important one? Or even really left a reading and thought about whether it was like that or not. I've always just been happy to be there, or unhappy to be there, you know, but just grateful for the liveliness one way or the other. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that other than that. I've just been lucky enough to be part of that world. It's a social life for me.
You know, I mean, I'm so interested in the Cambridge Poetry Festivals as well. And I guess part of the interest comes from the fact that, you know, it really seemed to be a poets event. Like it wasn't funded by like a marketing, like an arts organization, and poets put it together. And I guess like, I mean, the communal spirit in that, and also like, I mean, if you look at it like, you know, from an anti-capitalist lens, also, I mean, that's controversial as well. But like, I mean, I guess it really sort of like, I really like the fact that it was a poets event, you know, and
Okay, yeah, so I think there are pros and cons to that. I think one of the good things about that was that the quality of concentration was always very high, And the kinds of conversations that were had afterwards were intense, typically were very intense. Everyone in the room really wanted to talk to everyone else in the room, unless they hated each other for some reason. And everyone wanted to think really hard together. So yeah, it was a poet's poetry reading. However, there's of course something exclusionary about that kind of culture as well. And it did tend to be the case that, you know, often you get the same people in the room all of the time, and they all had their personal histories as well as their political histories. And quite often, you know, you sort of knew what someone was going to think about things. Whereas what's happened here in Brighton, and I credit Joe Luna in particular with this, he really helped create here a culture which was much more open, much more hospitable, much more attractive, I think, to people who aren't poets. So, you know, hundreds of people would show up some of these high zero readings. You know, most of them weren't poets at all. They just wanted to come for a good night out. Now, in Cambridge, that was crazy. You'd never have an event like that. You know, most of the readings in Cambridge weren't the Cambridge Poetry Festival, where you might be lucky to get a room with 50 people in it. But they were just readings in pubs where you'd be lucky to get 5 people in it sometimes. I can remember going to readings in Cambridge. I think I went to a reading by Christopher Middleton, where I think I was one of 3 people in the room. And, you know, it was very dour. It was in a wood-panelled room in a college. You know, everyone's kind of embarrassed and staring at the floor. And it just wasn't most people's idea of a good night out. And that's nothing to do with Christopher Middleton. It's just like the thought of doing something like that just wasn't a social event somehow. It was an event for the student of poetry to go along to. But there are definite losses. I mean, or maybe they're not losses exactly. Maybe it's just that the conversations are different kinds now. I mean, I love the conversations after, you know, we had one after Kat Sinclair's new series Placeholder. Yes. I had a great night. You know, it's just really, really fun chatting with Kat and Verity and everyone else who was there. But it isn't quite the same as the Cambridge conversations, which were both intellectually intense and fractious all the time. I think the Brighton Festival was somewhere in between. It was halfway between being a poets event and a more open. It's still true that most of the people there probably were poets, or, you know, even if they hadn't declared it yet, they were kind of poets. But not everyone was. It was more open. It was more of a social event, maybe, than Cambridge.
When you talk about the Brighton Festival, you mean the Sussex Poetry Festival?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, the Sussex Poetry Festival. Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, you were also talking about like the poetry in occupied spaces, like in, you know, by that, do you mean picket poetry or like something else? Because that sounded very interesting. Yeah,
people have read stuff on picket lines. I know. I haven't. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just too, I don't know, fussy about acoustics or something, or maybe I'm just too shy and awkward. I don't know. But I have read in occupied spaces, not on picket lines, but, you know, students here have a number of times occupied big lecture halls, and, you know, there was the additional frisson that staff were, you know, told loud and clear, you must not enter these spaces on pain of losing your job. So of course we were like, fuck that, and sort of, you know, strode in with our poems, and it just felt more exciting to be standing in solidarity with students who are, you know, performing a legal occupation for something that they believe in, and that I absolutely believed in too. So there was, the excitement and the value, the importance of those kinds of contexts were really brought a new kind of challenge to giving a performance, certainly. But they also kind of guaranteed an enthusiastic reception. And this is, I know that this is a pathological corner of my personality, or my kind of, this is my psychopathology, a modest little one, is that I have always felt very uncomfortable reading if I know that I'm guaranteed an enthusiastic reception. I don't know why. And it's very rare, of course, that you ever are guaranteed that reception, but provided that you say something angry at a protest reading, then you're virtually guaranteed. And, you know, and why not too, you know, good. Why should we all not have the same feelings in the same space at that moment? But I just feel like my poetry has never really very comfortably worked, or it just doesn't work quite. You know, when I try and find my poems which are the most rousing, which are the most straightforwardly, you know, antagonistic against whatever power it is that we're opposing, they also tend usually to involve forms of self-lacerating doubt, or kind of satires about the impotence of, you know, my own presence, or you know, or they spiral off into love poetry or whatever else it might be. So I never have something. It's a bit like trying to find a love poem for a wedding. All the love poems that are actually good are ambivalent about love. So you can't read them at a wedding. And then all the poems that are wholeheartedly positive about love are shit as poetry. There just isn't anything. And it's a bit similar for me. You know, I can't get over an unconquerable ambivalence about the potential social efficacy of my own poetry. So my poetry isn't exactly designed for those spaces. So I feel uncomfortable, but I still do it.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Well, so we do have a couple of more questions in here, but this is about performances and, you know, I mean, voicing of poetry, as you'd like to call it. But if you want to skip any of these questions, you can just tell me. But I mean, you've talked about this already, but so there is this persistent idea of attention between the page and the stage. That familiar tension in your work, like.
Okay, so until I read this question, I think I'd honestly never thought about reading my poetry in public as being on stage, though it has usually been, in fact, on a stage that I've done it. But when I hear the phrase on stage, I think about acting, I guess. So when I give a performance, I just think of myself as being in the room. And this is something I've talked about a lot, actually, in, you know, other contexts, like what does it mean that we're all in the same room? And my really dear friends, sadly, who died recently, Lauren Ballant, used to say that it's really important that we stay in the room. And what she meant by this was that even if someone might say something which you find like, you know, absolutely intolerably at odds with what you feel or believe about something, that we stop learning if we walk out. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. Sometimes I think I do want to, and sometimes I have walked out. But Lauren was really committed about this. It's a very serious intellectual position, one that I actually admired and almost envied, that she was going to stay in the room. But the idea of being in the room, I think, has been really important for me, that here I am in a room and I might know some of the people, I might not know most of the people. And why are the people there? Why have they been assembled? Why have they come? You know, and how do they feel about being there? And all those questions, I don't want to second guess any of those. And this is one reason why I don't like performance poetry or slam poetry. It over curates people's presence in the room. So particularly if you're all sitting at a table and you're all given a scorecard or audience participation, that kind of stuff, I find it just really tedious and overbearing, because it's too controlling. It tries to manipulate people's presence in the room too much for me. I don't want to be, you know, told to, you know, shout something back at the poet or sing a song along with them or whatever. I don't want to be conscripted. I want to be given my entire freedom to reflect and to think about what's going on. For me, there's a kind of Brechtian principle in that, actually. I really believe in trying to promote the maximum possible critical freedom of an audience in the room. Okay. So I don't want to be on stage and them in the audience exactly, though, of course, that really is the architecture of the space very often. But I do what I can to try to think about the inclusive character of the room, which includes both me and them. So for that reason too, I try not to be too stagey about the dynamics of performance. So I don't want to sort of, you know, stand there and use the base of the stage in some clever way. I'm not going to get dressed up in an outfit. I'm not going to do anything deliberate that is kind of posturing or I don't want to theatricalize at all my own reading. So I don't ever plan a reading in that way. I go up not knowing exactly what it's going to sound like, not knowing how fast it's going to be. I try to get myself as ignorant as possible as my preparation, and just to go up there and see how it feels in the moment, and then do what feels true to the text, and then see what happens. I only write. I just write. I'm not going to say I write for the page. I don't really know what that means, the page, anymore. So much stuff is circulated on screens anyway. I just write. And then if it ends up being read and I never print it, which some things, that has been the fate of a lot of things that I've done, then okay. And if it ends up being in a book and I've never read it aloud, then fine too. I certainly certainly never write for performance specifically, except a couple of times I've done that. The very first poem, as I mentioned, of Skirts Suspendiosos, I wrote because I knew I was giving a reading in Amsterdam. The very first start, at least, of the poem, sorry, not Skirts Suspendiosos, of the New Meditations. The very first part of Skirts Suspendiosos I wrote for the launch of my friend Rosy Carrick's book of Mayakovsky translations. She's another really good reader of her poetry.
Yeah, I'm going to be interviewing her next.
Yeah, great. Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't wait to hear what she says. I mean, she's an absolutely fantastic presence of writing, has done so much in the years. So
exactly.
anyhow, I wrote a thing for her, but those things that I wrote for those occasions weren't written for performance. They were just written for those occasions, which happened to be performance occasions. So yeah, I never write for it in that way. So insofar as there's a tension for me, it's always after the fact of writing. So here I've got this thing and it feels tense because I'm a bit anxious whether people will like it, or I'm a bit anxious whether I can really do it justice or something like that. So that's where the tension is. It's not there in the writing, because when I'm in the writing, the tension is between me, language, truth, history, other poets. That's it. It's not between the page and the stage for me.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Okay. So you've answered the question already about like whether you ever write pieces specifically for performance.
Yeah.
I guess, like, do you want to talk about what you can do in performance that you can't do in writing, or should we skip that?
Yeah. I mean, obviously you can share in real time, as it were, instantly with a group of people that you may not know, some impression of the poem, some articulation of it. But just to rewind back to where I started, for me, I learned something about my writing through performance that I can't learn just by writing it. So I learn, I mean, again, to talk about Kate Francis's book launch recently, when people burst into laughter at certain moments of that, I learned something then that was really valuable to me. I learned that there was a comedy in this piece, which was a tragic piece, really, which, well, perhaps not tragic, but it was a piece which was certainly broken-hearted, and that there's a comedy in it which is explicit to others. Now, I knew in a sense that there was a comedy in it that for me was implicit in the piece, a kind of twisted, tortured comedy, but it wasn't at all clear to me that that would ever be transmissible or detectable even by others. But there they were all laughing. So, wow, okay, I learned something. And that was really reassuring. And I felt, I don't want to be too presumptuous about what anyone else felt in that room, but I felt actually emotionally as though I'd been a little bit given a hug in that moment, because it was like, okay, this is something that I can share in this moment, and we're going to share it through laughter. We're going to share it through a certain kind of collective moment of unexpected pleasure. Great, that's a relief. This isn't just pure, me, kind of strafing myself with the unspeakable. This is something which is speakable, and there it is. So yeah, I learn about what my poems mean, and sometimes I learn that I'm going to be able to go on writing them. That's something I can't always learn just by writing them.
And I guess, I mean, you were also talking about very beautifully about like being in the room and like, theoretically what that means. And I guess, like, performing is a beautiful part of just enabling that, I guess, like, the sort of the collective experience of being in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. Spontaneous, like temporary collectivities, I think can be really, really beautiful. I think sometimes the despondency that it's possible to feel about any kind of communist project in the future can get too much kind of strangled by the apparent hopelessness of any form of permanent collectivity which we might want to inhabit. But there are forms of temporary, unstable, flare-ups of collectivization which are possible right now. And are they going to suddenly transform the structure of economic society? Obviously not, but nonetheless. And it's not just about giving us an intimation of something that will exist in the future, being in that kind of room. It is the future in the room. It is something, there it is, we're living it right now. There's some friends of mine who are in the Occupy movement in the States, ended up saying that they got really frustrated arguing with critics of the movement who said that, this isn't even a blueprint of a future commune, because outside the ring fence of your occupation, cops are there as usual. Said, but for no matter about that, for just look in for a second, this is a commune right now. Look, we're all feeding each other, we're all doing. So I feel like that. I have a kind of optimism about the present as well. I want the room itself to matter right now. It is a kind of spontaneous collectivization for a moment, not always, of course, and not necessarily for everyone in the room, but then that's unfortunately true of communism, of course.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, the last bit, this interview is about organizing and your role as an organizer. So, I mean, I'm going to ask Rosy this as well, about like her involvement with the Brighton and Hove Hammer Tongue. Like, it's in the brilliant work that she's been doing there. But I mean, we can pause a bit if you want.
No, let's go on. I have a meeting, unfortunately, at 1 o'clock that I'm going to have to run to, so I'd rather keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So, do you just want to talk quickly about your involvement with the Sussex Poetry Festival? How did that come about?
Sure. Yeah, so it started in 2009. It came about because I and a number of colleagues decided that it'd just be something really good to do, that we'd like to get poets together, that we had at that point a little pot of resources, so we should make some good use of it. So Sarah Krangle, who I know you know, of course, and Daniel Kane, who was here then, but has since moved abroad to work, and we got together and we organised a festival that was really fun. It started out, first of all, on the Sussex campus, and then after the first night of that festival, migrated into town to the Nightingale Theatre, which is near the train station in Brighton. And then there was subsequent sort of shifts and different iterations of this. Joe Luna got involved, and then Joe and I and Sarah were doing it together for a bit, and then Joe and I and Daniel, and then Sarah and Daniel both moved on. And since then, more recently, Joe and I and my colleagues Natalia Cecilia and Sam Solomon have been organising it in recent years. And it's kind of effectively was halted in 2019 with the sort of breakout of the COVID pandemic, which meant that we just couldn't do it for a bit. And then it hasn't resumed since then for a number of different reasons. And I think maybe it's worth saying just a word about these. Partly it was just the loss of impetus through COVID. Partly it was that we've just lost all of our funding, and it's a reality which I expect you're going to hear from lots of different people, that in this country there's so little money available to organise these things, and they're always done on people's free labour. So we were all doing this for free, not just for free, at a cost to ourselves. I would drive to the airport, without being able to claim expenses, pick people up, bring them back, and put them up in my own flat. I would do that every year, all of the time. So it was tiring, it was exhausting, but we loved doing it and we wanted to do it. We did it, for love, if that doesn't sound too implausible or too naive. It's the kind of labour that we were doing because we loved it, and we loved the poets, we loved hearing them. So, but it's the kind of labour that you do for free in a community, I do think very often is kind of dependent on the survival of forms of goodwill towards the institution in whose name you're doing it, and which uses your labour and advertises your labour as part of it's what makes it attractive. So Sussex has continued to do that, continued to advertise the Sussex Poetry Festival, but I think all of us felt a little bit like the goodwill which had allowed us to do that labour for free for such a long time had perhaps expired for the time being, anyway, due to various things that happened, rounds of redundancies of our colleagues, struggling through strikes. So there are internal problems with the institutional context here, which have nothing really to do with poetry, but which for us absolutely emotionally, psychologically bear on the work that we were doing for free for the institution as well as for the poets. So that's another reason why I think it has unfortunately kind of dried up. Yeah, but we may go back to doing it. I get asked all the time, are you going to do another one? I'd love to, but it is very tiring. And I have to say, for me now, having 2 kids, I can't any longer put people up at my house. I can't, it's much harder. Whenever I do organize something like this, it creates more work for my partner. And it's just very, very hard to I don't want to create work like that. It's easier when you're freer and you don't have other responsibilities. But yeah, so it was a pleasure to do. It was also enough to give you a nervous breakdown often, because kind of trying to keep together big groups of poets from all over the place, often people with very fragile sensibilities, sometimes for good reasons. So yeah, it can be very tiring, exhausting emotional labour and real physical labour as well. But it was a pleasure doing it for all that time. There were some great readings at it. Some of the readings were just breathtaking. Some amazing stuff that happened. But I prefer to go along and not be the organizer for a while, not have to clear up at the end of the night and make sure everyone's got somewhere to sleep. It's kind of tiring.
I guess this feeds into a question about the structural barriers you experience do you want to answer that next? Because I guess, like, you know,
Sure.
it feeds from, so what are the structural barriers you experienced as an organizer?
Yeah. So money is the obvious one. So just to get this into an international perspective, I was really fortunate enough to be invited to go and read at a little miniature festival at the University of California at Berkeley back in, I guess it must have been 2011 or 12, invited by Lynn Haginian. And a whole bunch of English poets were invited out there, maybe not that many, but maybe half a dozen or so. And I can't tell you exactly what the budget for this might have been, but certainly each of us would put up for a long time in a nice hotel, flights paid for, a nice honorarium, taken out for dinner every night, etc. A big budget, essentially. I later was lucky enough to have a visiting fellowship at Berkeley, and you know, Lynn became a good friend and colleague, and we were just, you know, we were able to do these things. When I was working a few years later at Princeton in 2016 on a similar 6-month gig, again, a really fortunate visiting fellowship that I had, I asked if I could bring over a couple of poets from the UK, Verity Spott, Stuart Calton, to come and give readings at Princeton. And a slightly nervous looking administrator said, well, how much money do you need for this? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they'd be very happy to come in budget flights. They can both stay in my flat. And the administrator said, oh, of course, no, we've never asked them to do that. You know, how much do you want? And I said, well, I don't know, how about $5,000? She said, oh, of course. She said, here, have 10. And, you know, I could have probably got 30, you know, so there are these big wealthy institutions in the States which can do these things, which can treat poets with that kind of, you know, it's not even exactly luxury. They're just going to give them a hotel and a bit of spending money. We just can't do any of that. We can't put them up in a hotel. No money, no per diems even, so they can get a sandwich, nothing. So in Berlin, in Paris, every time I've read in these other places in Europe, in Amsterdam when I was there recently, absolute minimum, travel, hotel for several days, and an honorarium, which would be at least a couple of £100, whatever. And, you know, you get picked up from the hotel, picked up from the airport, driven. Here in this country, we just don't have a culture of that kind of thing. You know, it's one of many, many indications or symptoms, really, of the contempt in which particularly more experimental art is held in this country. Either you go through the ringer of applying for Arts Council funding, and then you get one big check after months and months of being coached by professional consultants to tell you how to get the money, what boxes you need to tick in order to get it. And then you get this money, and then you've got to, you know, get a professional accountant to show what you've done with it, or you just like do it for free, and that's what we've been doing now. So, you know, these reading series in Brighton are just done for free. People work for free, or they're done for an absolute pittance of money. So there is nothing like this, certainly not for poets like us. There are bigger festivals like Stanza in Scotland, where you might get a hotel and a bit of spending money, but that's not for the likes of us. You know, that's for the kind of poetical mainstream elite of Britain, you know, the ones who are published by Faber and on Radio 4 and that kind of people. So that is the biggest structural barrier. As far as venues and that kinds of things go, I mean, the people that I know are really happy to do it anywhere. You know, we'll do it in someone's bathroom. It doesn't really matter. So in fact, in a sense, the grottier and the more underground, the better for us. We don't want to do it in Brighton Dome. That would be dreadful. It would be empty. So you know, let's do it in the pub. That's fine. That doesn't feel like a barrier to me. But yeah, money is the big structural barrier.
Yeah, thank you for putting that into perspective. Like,
But I wonder if you could talk about like venues and space and cities a little bit more. I mean, you were talking about this like initially a little bit, like the shift from Cambridge to Brighton and then Sussex Poetry. Is there like a particular ethos behind selecting Brighton as the host city for like these, or Sussex? Or
I mean, well, we chose Brighton because we all live here. So first it was just natural and obvious, and we wouldn't have got even the little bit of money that we got from Sussex unless we had done it here. So first, I mean, it was just there was no decision to be made. However, that was a good bit of luck that we all do happen to live here, because Brighton is just, I think, you know, it's like any city in the world, there's plenty of problems in Brighton, but compared to most cities in the UK, I think Brighton is a wonderful city in all sorts of ways. So I mentioned that we our first venue in town was the Nightingale Theatre. Our second venue in town, after we could no longer use the Nightingale, was the Marlborough pub. I don't know if you know the Marlborough. Yeah, right, great. So the Marlborough has a theatre upstairs, and we used that. And this obviously is a queer pub, and it's a really fantastic, wonderful, welcoming venue for us. And it just felt like a great place to have our festival. Not only because we just support everything that it does, but it's just so much more fun for us. You know, there was a disco afterwards, in the downstairs part of the bar, and it was just really, really lovely to be there and in that community, part of that community for a whole weekend, and for some of the people downstairs to come up and hear what we were doing. You know, it's just amazing. So, I mean, there is, I mean, all of the poetry reading series here have always been like this. I've always been very, very programmatic, thoughtful, deliberate about being, I don't know whether they'd use the word diverse or what would use inclusive, whatever word they'd want to use. But, you know, there's just a serious kind of communitarian, sometimes anarchistic politics here, which is really about trying to provide spaces in which, or I might say a room in which people can come along who will feel really not only welcome, but will feel like it's really important that everyone wants to hear what they're saying in that space. And that's true of Verity Spott's reading series, Horseplay, you know, absolutely, that's what it's about. And about the poetry, of course. And that's really true about Placeholder, and before that High Zero, and that was true about the Sussex Poetry Festival too. So there's definitely a politics, but I think luckily here we've got kind of beyond the point, is my impression anyhow, of it being about the politics in a way where you have to kind of advertise that that's what it's about. So whereas elsewhere in the country it might still be true that you'd have to, you know, you can sense sometimes that festivals are organized on a slightly nervous way, where they've made sure that everyone will know that this is a kind of enlightened, you know, organization culture. Here, this is just what our culture is, and it has been for a very, very long time. It would be here absolutely extraordinary if there were a festival which were organized, which wasn't full of kind of, you know, left-wing queer poets talking about, you know, their experience of oppression. You know, that's just what the scene is. So
that's just,
that's how it is. And that's great. And I love that. And so we're just lucky to be in that world anyway. It's not just the poetry world. That's the social community that we're in anyway. Now, that's not to say the whole city is like that. Of course it's not. Or that people who live here are, you know, altogether safe living here. Of course they're not. But they might be a bit safer and feel a bit more welcome than elsewhere, maybe. You know, I don't want to speak on anyone's behalf, but that's what I've heard people say. And certainly I feel really lucky to be here for that reason myself.
I know. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm just going to maybe finish with like one last question about the Sussex Poetry Festival. But can you talk a bit more about the poets you read there, or the poets you've hosted over the years?
Well, there's so many. I mean, I don't know how many there have been, but it would be certainly hundreds and hundreds. So, I mean, one thing that I try to do every year, and I say when we, of course, all organise it together, but this was my own little pet bit of it that I would always do each year, was to try to bring poets over whose language was not English, so that we could have a translation sort of little feature in each festival each year. So for me, that was always really exciting. And I sometimes I would make the translations of the work myself and then would read it with them. So Jean-Marie Glaise came over and did an amazing reading from his book Trouver Ici, and I did the translation. We read this together. That was a real highlight for me. I loved doing that with him. I mean, I never met him before the reading, but I loved reading it together with him. And more recently, Lao Shiwu, the Chinese poet who had been in prison in China for his involvement in the 1989 revolution in Tiananmen Square, and who was tortured for years in a prison, came over and did an amazing reading for us. And his translator, Michael Day, came over from San Francisco and did the English for us. That was an amazing reading. The ceiling literally started caving in. He was reading so loud. He'd worn this big traditional golden like Chinese garb. He had this drum that he was screaming his poetry. Plaster started falling off the ceiling, and he was just screaming this poem about being tortured. It was overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming. And it was on the last night, and everyone was kind of drunk, and it was all it just really felt almost like you're in a plane that was going down, but it was going down somewhere wonderful. And there've been so many, you know, great readings over the years. So as well as the translation stuff, we've always tried to make it a space a room where lots of students can read as well. So every year there's been lots of students from the University of Sussex and other students who've come and read. And we haven't like sort of sectioned them off as the students in the way that happened at the Cambridge Festival, at least when I was a student. So we don't want that. It's a very sort of fluid, and everyone's just doing their thing. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Sean. Obviously, Sean died sadly a number of years ago, and you know, when I think back now to friends that we've lost who read, it's moving to think of them being there, both reading and just being there, and you know, drinking and talking. You know, with Sean, not just at Sussex, of course, but all over the place. You know, Sean and I also did some readings together, including collaboratively sometimes. So I remember those now sadly and fondly. But yeah, I mean, I mean, for me, the Sussex Festival was always about both the readings, the variety of poets, giving people a chance to read who hadn't really done, some of them never done it before. It was really important for me that there should be poets whose language was not English, that they should come from far and wide. It was really important that it was kind of obvious to everybody what the kind of communitarian, inclusive ethos was, and you know, the values of the thing were. And you know, just the chance for us to feel like, maybe also the scholars, the academics who organized it, to feel like they had a more living relationship with the stuff that they love, with poetry, that it wasn't just delivering stuff in classrooms with syllabuses, etc., but being there and really celebrating that stuff was actually still alive, that it still mattered out there in the world. So we tried to make it as anti-academic, as anti-institutional as possible. And that's also a way of staying sane when you're stuck in an institution most of the time.
That's true. That's true. Well, thank you so much. It's because, you know, that covers like all of my questions, I guess. But thank you so much for like talking so fulsomely about your work and your you know, poetry and all of it. Like, you know, it's just, I do you mind if I stop recording?
No, just before you do, well, just thank you as well. Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation, all your questions.
I was glad I was you know, able to like hold space for this.
But stop whenever you want, of course.
Okay. Okay.